It was a sunny September afternoon in 1920. Bank clerks were heading to lunch, traders flooded out of the New York Stock Exchange, and within seconds, the heart of American finance was ripped apart. A horse-drawn wagon, packed with dynamite and iron shrapnel, exploded outside J.P. Morgan's headquarters. 38 people were killed, hundreds injured, and to this day, no one knows who did it. This is the story of the Wall Street bombing of 1920, a violent minute that revealed the fragility of a changing nation. In the months following World War I, America was on the verge of a boiling point. The economy was volatile. Wages and prices swung wildly, and nothing felt steady. Headlines warned of radicals, and neighbours whispered the same. In that pressure, the blast at Wall and Broad became a grim turning point in domestic terrorism. It shattered more than windows. It took lives and punctured the belief that the titans of money and the institutions they built were beyond the reach of political violence. The bombing did not happen in a vacuum. It came after strikes and inflation, after deportations and raids, and it grew in the shadows of anarchist plots and government repression. Wall Street, the symbolic heart of capitalism, was a tempting stage. To some, only dramatic force could answer what they saw as injustice. The attack left a literal scar, the pockmarked granite facade of J.P. Morgan and Company at 23 Wall Street. You can still see it today. It left a legacy too. New police powers, hardened attitudes, and a question no one can agree on. Who did it and why? To understand why a horse-drawn wagon became a bomb in Manhattan's financial district, you have to enter the atmosphere of the United States in 1919 and 1920. The nation had just emerged from World War I, but peace did not bring calm. Demobilization sent millions of soldiers home to compete for jobs. Wartime production ended, supply chains snapped, and inflation rose. Prices soared more than 15% in 1919, while wages and working conditions lagged. Industries, ranging from steel to coal, saw massive strikes. Seattle experienced a general strike. Boston's police force walked off the job. Newspapers turned every picket line into a front-page fear. On top of the economic stress, political paranoia surged. In April and June of 1919, a wave of mail bombs went out to public figures. One blew up on the doorstep of Attorney General Mitchell Palmer in Washington, D.C. It injured his family and shook the highest levels of government. Many blamed anarchists, especially followers of the Italian radical Luigi Gallieni. These Gallienists called for revolution against capitalist and state power, and they even printed step-by-step guides to making bombs. After that came the Palmer raids, a broad crackdown that led to arrests and deportations of suspected radicals. Prominent anarchist voices like Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were deported to Russia in December 1919. The Bureau of Investigation, the forerunner of the FBI, expanded its surveillance of immigrant communities and left-wing groups. Newspapers printed stories about Bolshevik plots. Immigrants, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe, found themselves singled out as potential enemies. The climate was angry and fearful, and it was not just rhetoric. From street corners to union halls, from factories to newsrooms, the country was arguing about who belonged and who was to blame for the unrest. It is here, in this atmosphere of suspicion and pain, that the 1920 Wall Street bombing took shape. Wall and Broad Street was, and remains, one of the most iconic intersections in American history. On one corner stood the US, Sub-Treasury Building, now Federal Hall National Memorial, with George Washington's statue looking down on the flagstone steps. Across the street was the New York Stock Exchange. The real power, at least symbolically, sat at 23 Wall Street, the headquarters of J.P. Morgan and Company. The House of Morgan meant old money and new influence. It underwrote railroads, steadied markets, and, in the eyes of its critics, held too much sway over the nation's fortunes. On Thursday, September 16, 1920, the streets were crowded as usual. Messengers darted between offices. Brokers moved in and out of the exchange. Secretaries crossed the street with lunch pails. A horse-drawn wagon, the most ordinary sight in the city, rolled onto Wall Street, and stopped in front of the Morgan Building shortly before noon. No one knew that under the wagon seat rested crates of dynamite. Inside the wagon were hundreds of pounds of cast iron sash weights, packed around the explosives as deadly shrapnel. The device had likely been set on a timing mechanism. The bomber, whoever he was, would have needed only a few minutes to position the wagon, set the timer, and melt into the crowd. Some witnesses later recalled seeing a man jump down and walk away. Others remembered nothing at all until the blast. Investigators would soon piece together a rough understanding of the weapon. Accounts vary in detail, but the consensus from police and federal memory is that the bomb contained a significant amount of dynamite, combined with as much as 500 pounds of iron slugs. The iron pieces, often described as sash weights, turned the wagon into a giant fragmentation grenade. The intention was clear. Whoever planted the bomb wanted to kill, and not just to blow out a few windows. Why Wall Street? The motives people point to come straight from the political fights of the day. The House of Morgan stood for the capitalist system that anarchists hated. The street drew a daily crowd, so the shock would be maximum, and there were fresh sparks. In May 1920, Italian immigrants Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were arrested in Massachusetts for a payroll robbery and a murder. They moved in Gallienist circles. Gallienists were followers and supporters of the Italian immigrant anarchist Luigi Gallieni, an insurrectionary figure who was most active in the United States after he arrived. Those arrests and the ongoing government crackdowns on radicals made a volatile mix. Many historians see the Wall Street bombing as part revenge, part warning. It was also propaganda by deed, a violent act meant to speak louder than words. No court ever produced definitive proof linking the attack to one person or group. Even so, many researchers think Gallienist networks are the most likely culprits. There is one name that comes up repeatedly in the literature and the notes of investigators. Mario Buda, also known as Mike Boda, was an associate of Sacco and Vanzetti. Buda was a skilled mechanic who did not shy away from radical circles. He had been linked to earlier bomb plots and was in the New York area in September 1920. Within days of the Wall Street explosion, he left the United States for Italy. He was never charged, and in a strict legal sense, the case remains open. Unfortunately, the lack of a definitive confession and the disappearance of key figures leave us with probabilities rather than certainties. At 12:01 p.m., the wagon detonated. As one witness, Jacob Roth, later recalled, "I was blown against a window shield by the explosion which rocked Manhattan Island." Other witnesses spoke of a blast, like a clap of thunder, followed by a scorching wind. They saw a blinding flash, then darkness. The explosion was so powerful that it lifted people off the ground. It embedded iron weights into walls and window frames, drove glass shards into bodies, and threw a shower of debris into the street. The horse, the wagon, and the crates were obliterated. A crater about a foot or two deep marred the pavement. The massive glass windows of the Morgan Building shattered inward. Downtown Manhattan, the place that prided itself on order and schedules, became a scene of chaos. People emerged from buildings, dazed and bleeding, stumbling over rubble. Clerks dragged injured colleagues to safety. Bystanders ripped shirts into bandages. A postal truck became an impromptu ambulance. Smoke and dust filled the air, choking those who ran to help. The statue of George Washington looked down through a haze. The screams carried to the exchange, where trading halted. In that first hour, numbers were impossible to tally, but soon the death toll mounted. 30 people died, almost immediately. By the time the wounded were counted, the final number would reach 38 dead and hundreds injured. Many of the victims were young office workers seated near windows or walking out to lunch. A few were messengers who had waited beside the wagon. A tragic irony hovered over the scene. The people who died were, in many cases, the most ordinary and least powerful on Wall Street. Within minutes, law enforcement and emergency services swarmed the area. The New York Police Department sealed off streets. Firefighters doused flames and searched for survivors. Ambulances poured in from every direction. The coroner's trucks followed. City officials, including Police Commissioner Richard Enright, arrived with detectives to oversee the early stages of the investigation. Federal agents were dispatched from nearby offices. William J. Flynn, director of the Bureau of Investigation and a veteran of anti-anarchist work, soon took a leading role. The city was jittery. Rumors flew that a second bomb was set to go off. Quickly, officers ordered offices cleared while others swept buildings for suspicious packages. None were found. Almost immediately, the search began for clues. Investigators examined the crater and picked iron fragments out of the walls. Pieces of the horse were found blocks away. Detectives collected bits of the wagon, trying to reconstruct its make and model. That same afternoon, postal inspectors discovered a handful of printed circulars in a nearby mailbox. The leaflets read, in essence, "Remember, we will not tolerate. Free the political prisoners, or it will be sure death for all of you." They were signed American Anarchist Fighters. Some of the papers were scorched, as if they had been hastily thrown and partly burned at the moment of the blast. The message seemed obvious. This was political violence, a response to the government's aggressive actions against radicals. The practical problem for investigators was that the leaflets did not come with names. They were typed on an ordinary machine and printed on cheap paper that could have come from any shop. New York's financial leaders moved quickly to act in resilience. Within 24 hours, the stock exchange reopened. Traders went back to work under boarded windows. J.P. Morgan, who was away in Europe, issued no public statement. His bank quietly swept the blood and broken glass from its marble floors. The message was plain, at least for the street's masters. Markets would not bow to terror. But the police presence never really left. Uniforms and detectives stood at corners and paced in front of the bank. The plaza returned to life, but it never forgot. The scars in the granite facade at 23 Wall Street, small pits where iron slugs struck and lodged, were left unrepaired, perhaps as a warning or a memorial. The effort to find the bomber became one of the most intense manhunts of the decade. New York and federal investigators interviewed thousands of people. They tracked down vendors who sold horses and wagons, scoured livery stables, and checked recent sales. Detectives examined time clocks at nearby companies, looking for employees who disappeared during lunch. Agents followed leads to radical meeting halls and immigrant boarding houses. The leaflets became a central clue. Investigators compared the typeface to known radical publications. They visited printing shops from Manhattan to Brooklyn. They questioned suspected anarchists in Little Italy and Paterson, New Jersey, and in the Connecticut factory towns where Galleonist influence had once been strong. They arrested and questioned people with prior arrest records related to explosives. A few suspects were held for weeks. None was charged in the bombing. The most credible theory pointed to homegrown anarchists. The Galleonists were skilled, motivated, and known to have used exactly the kind of iron-packed bombs that shattered Wall Street. Investigators noted the timing of the Wall Street attack. It could have been chosen to draw attention to cases like Sacco and Vanzetti. They also noticed something more concrete. Mario Buda had been in and out of the New York area with associates of Sacco and Vanzetti. After the bombing, he left for Italy abruptly. By the spring of 1921, with no arrests made, the official investigation began to cool. The city and business groups had offered large rewards, reportedly totaling tens of thousands of dollars. No one came forward. The trail grew cold. Files were boxed and stored. For the Bureau of Investigation, the case became part of the institutional memory that shaped the government's approach to domestic terrorism for decades to come. The Wall Street bombing did not topple a government or crash a stock market, but it did leave an imprint on American history. First, it demonstrated that politically motivated violence could strike at the very core of American finance. The event shattered any illusion that elites and institutions enjoyed a protective shield in the heart of Manhattan. The image of the Morgan Building's scarred facade became a symbol of vulnerability that money could not erase. Second, it fueled a law and order response that had already been gathering steam. Police surveillance of labour and immigrant communities grew more aggressive. The Bureau of Investigation continued to build files on radicals, a practice that would expand in the 1920s and 1930s under Hoover's leadership. The bombing became part of a larger narrative that national security required a robust federal investigative presence. Techniques such as systematic fingerprinting, centralised criminal files, and interagency cooperation continued to grow during this period. Third, it reinforced a political climate that favoured restriction over openness. The first national quotas on immigration, the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, were passed months after the bombing. The even more restrictive Immigration Act of 1924 followed. These laws were justified on many grounds, but the fear of radicalism linked to immigrant communities played a central role. The image of a foreign-born anarchist with a bomb became a crude caricature used to sell stricter borders. Finally, it left a wound in the story of the city. The 1920 bombing is among the deadliest acts of terrorism in New York before the 21st century, yet it drifted out of public memory for many decades. The unhealed stone on Wall Street is something of a hidden memorial. Guides point to the pockmarks on the Morgan building during walking tours. A small plaque marks the event, but it is easy to pass by without a glance. Perhaps people wanted to forget, or maybe the city's rush to keep moving buried the story. But the bombing's DNA is woven into the evolution of public safety and the government's ideas about preventing domestic terrorism. The 1920 Wall Street bombing took place at the intersection of anger and symbolism. On a raw level, the attack was a calculated strike at a crowded place, using a simple delivery method and a brutal design. On a political level, it was a message aimed at the heart of finance and the government that radicals believed protected it. The government's response, a massive investigation that failed to produce charges, shaped the expansion of federal law enforcement. The social and political aftermath, from increased surveillance to tighter immigration laws, reflected the anxiety of the age. It also set patterns for how the United States would think about domestic terrorism. To this day, the case remains officially unsolved. A compelling theory points to Italian anarchist networks, and to Mario Buda in particular. However, the absence of verified direct evidence leaves historians careful in their language. A mystery persists. That lingering uncertainty gives the event a powerful resonance. It is part of a category of unsolved mysteries that complicate American history. It forces us to confront how fear, policy, and memory interact in the face of violence. As you walk by 23 Wall Street, you can run your fingers over the little craters in the limestone. Each one is a physical reminder of a single minute that changed lives and policies. It tells us that the Roaring Twenties began not only with jazz and speakeasies, but also with a bang that announced a new era of risk at home. For a brief time, a horse-drawn wagon on a Manhattan street made the modern world feel fragile.